appears that most people knew that torture was something that was objectively bad, at least when used out of context. Which brings us to this entire section. Now, quickly, it's worth mentioning that in these early examples of torture regulation, there aren't many cases where a specific torture method is outright banned. But don't worry, we're getting there. What we do see in these early cases of torture regulation is the outright ban of the use of torture in certain contexts and on certain groups of people. And of course, these early regulations and laws turn into what will eventually become the banning of specific torture methods and eventually the outright ban of torture altogether, which is why it's worth mentioning this brief history, albeit quickly. Let's pick up exactly where we left off in ancient Babylon. Like I just mentioned in the previous section, the Code of Hammurabi, the legal code of Babylon, has the first ever recorded mention of torture, which is interesting, but it's also not that cut and dry. You see, the Code of Hammurabi suggests that Babylonian culture was simply not using torture for no apparent reason. It instead suggested that these torture methods be regulated under the guide of an eye for an eye, essentially meaning the severity of your crime should match the severity of your punishment. Which lines up exactly with the example I gave earlier, where a wife and her secret boyfriend end up killing her husband. They will both suffer torture and death because they caused death on her husband. And whether or not that is moral or just is up to you to decide. However, that's how it was done at the time. And the ancient Babylonians and the Code of Hammurabi, if nothing else, prove that torture was common and literally used to enforce the law. It was also regulated to only be a punishment, and a fitting punishment at that. Now, whether or not these guidelines were followed even a little, if at all, is another story. However, if nothing else, there was at least a written suggestion on how torture should be used. Skipping ahead over 1,000 years from ancient Babylon to ancient Greece, we have an entirely new set of rules surrounding torture. And even though we have over 1,000 years of societal and human development and progress, it almost seems like the rules around torture took one or numerous steps backwards. In ancient Greece, there was no formal ban of torture. However, there was a general exemption of torture for all civilians. However, it's important to understand who is and isn't a civilian in ancient Greece. Civilian doesn't just mean non-member of the military. It also means non-slave and non-foreigner. And both of those groups of people weren't necessarily uncommon in ancient Greece, meaning that torture also wasn't uncommon. But it gets worse. In ancient Babylon, it was at least suggested that torture only be used as a punishment for a crime, and that the severity of the punishment be equal to the severity of the crime. However, in ancient Greece, while torture could be used as a punishment, it was also more commonly used as a method of collecting testimony. And the reason for this is because in ancient Greece, if there was an ongoing legal situation and a slave had evidence that could be helpful in this legal situation, a slave could not simply offer evidence, as slave evidence was often only admissible under duress, which, to put